Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Ron, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's like the third time, and I'm happy to chat with you.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever asked you this, but there's obviously a lot of stuff that comes up in the whole 60s and 70s and from the counterculture movements, just everything that's going on. Even, I mean, you could add the 50s in there as well, too, from censorship and film to so much that's going on. I mean, do you think that, like, I wouldn't call it necessarily a conspiratorial subject, but do you think it's opened you up to more malicious behavior of the what we'd call the establishment that people might label conspiracy? Like, people don't know what COINTELPRO is. You mention that, they go, that sounds like a conspiracy, and toss their hands up. But it's like there's a whole area that the academic community hasn't really talked about or focused in depth to as much as a researcher or someone has with some of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I'm curious, do you have a conspiracy line? And also, do you think that you are more critical of the government because you know they do things in a very drastic sense, like programs like COINTELPRO?
I do have, I guess what you say, call a conspiracy line. Um, some things, well, Michael Peretti, he's a guy, he's retired. He used to be a philosophy professor at University of Vermont and then out in California. And he's written a few books. And one of my favorite lines of his that kind of describes my take on it too. He says, there are conspiracies. He says, there are like a bunch of usually men in rooms making decisions about our life to protect their to protect their profits and their property, et cetera, and their power. And he said, however, it's not, those conspiracies are just what they are, is they're part of what I would call like the greater conspiracy of well, capitalism, basically, because I would just see it as a when your entire, when the way you operate, the primary modus operandi is to pursue as much profit as you can. That's going to create a situation where you're going to do things that make sure that that happens, and that's the foundation of our political and culture, well, political society and economic society, obviously. And so obviously it bleeds over into culture, and it bleeds over into daily life of everybody, whether you're wealthy or poor or somewhere in between. And so there are groups of people who operate, they could be a bunch of CEOs, they could be a bunch of, boards. Take a look at a college, for example. The board of trustees at most colleges, whether they're public or private, or religious oriented or whatever, the majority of them are very wealthy people from the community, people and a couple politicians usually and then since the 60s, they've allowed faculty to have a representative, and then they usually allow students to have a representative, whether or not that student, even if that student is a voting representative, basically a lot of times they're going to be the lone vote because everybody else is going to vote in favor of the profit driven proposals. So it's a grand conspiracy, but not in the way that we think of conspiracies of, like, say, a bunch of like Klan members getting together and saying, okay, we're going to go burn down this house and then burn this church down or something like that, and so on and so forth. Then we're going to make it so that the government, we control the government by, doing whatever to the elections. But at the same time, there are those groups of people who do that. I mean, like the board of, political parties, the heads of political parties, very wealthy people who sit on a lot of boards, and they're not all bad conspiracies. But I mean, if you think of the regular, the term, what conspiracy means, it's a group of people getting together to further their ends, and that can be positive, that can be negative, and of course that's perspective. In my opinion, negative would be people trying to, the kind of conspiracies that we exist in today, whether it's Donald Trump and his people, the Democratic leadership and their people, or the heads of the war industry, the various defense corporations, when they get together and say, okay, we're going to go to Congress and we're going to tell them we need this. Congress is going to go along with that. So yeah, I don't know if that's a really clear answer, but
It's a good
there
answer,
are.
is what it was, because my explanation for like what I would call a deep state, and people go, "Oh, you think a bunch of people in cloaks?" I'm like, look, there might be some of that. Our government's just weird. But I always just bring up it's just an unhealthy relationship with capitalism. There's a lot of things people would call institutions that we're supposed to be respecting that they don't anymore because of the fact there's been massive amount of corruption. I don't know where it starts. Like, let's take an example, the CIA on college campuses. Why is that a thing? Why has that is still going on today? It was exposed and nobody's done anything about it. We've just exposed it and that was it. Moved on. No punishment. No, we're not going to stop you from doing this. And then also like black budgets, things of this sort that go on that our government does have. They never disclosed their budget in the church committee. And that was the last time we ever got to know what was going on. And I'm sure they're doing a lot more from 1975. But I noticed that a lot of those topics and conversations start to kind of people roll their eyes. That's a conspiracy because they just don't know. And I like your explanation of that. And I do think it's capitalism. I think it is this unhealthy relationship in places we shouldn't have business ties and financial interest involved in. Education is a prime example, but I don't, to me, it's just surprising because you can look through history and see it relevant there as well, too. And we haven't done anything about the change on it.
Yeah. I mean, I know people talk about the grand conspiracies, the historical ones like the Illuminati and so on and so forth, the Masons, whatever. But if you really, I delved into this back like when I was really interested in trying to figure out, are conspiracies a real thing? Are they not? And you can't. I mean, if you go down that hole, you ultimately there's enough that's real that makes you keep on digging, but you also run into a lot of contradictions, and some of those contradictions are just how it is because life is full of contradictions. And nobody, no matter how powerful, it seems like no group of people, no matter how powerful they are able to always be in control of what's going on. Like think of something like the United States government, the British Empire, the Vatican. Just think of any historically, especially the British Empire and the Vatican. They've been around a lot longer than the United States. But there are things that they do or that they've done historically that were there to, they intentionally did it to increase their power and to decrease or destroy their opposition's power. So that in its way is a conspiracy. But then there's also, there are a lot of things that just happen. And you were mentioning going back to the United States. My father used to, he was in the Air Force, but he worked for NSA, National Security Agency. And he said that, I remember once in high school, him and I used to have conversations, debates, arguments, whatever, because he was on one side of the war. I was on the other side, obviously, back in the late 60s, early 70s. And he used to talk about, he would always say to me, if you knew what I knew. And I was like, okay. I said, but that's not really fair. And so I would just ask him questions about why don't the CIA and NSA, why don't we know what their budgets are? And he said, because they need to have whatever money is available to them to do what they need to do. And he never really questioned what he was doing until he got older and had been out of that world for like a few decades, but even up to his final days, he believed that what he was doing was right. And he saw himself, he said, I don't see myself as part of a grander conspiracy. But he said, ultimately, I guess that's what I was. So it's not even necessarily a conscious thing. Once you take the job, you kind of become part of it, especially if you're working in those kind of organizations, the military, up in the corporate levels, and especially in intelligence, what people go back and forth on calling the deep state. Yeah, the deep state itself. I don't know. I think we talked about this a little bit one of the other times we conversed. There was some directive that came out like right before or right around the time the United States entered World War II that basically created what we call the military-industrial complex and made the Pentagon the most powerful entity in the United States government.
I
So,
actually,
and that,
I was
and
gonna.
that,
Oh,
I
go
wish
ahead.
I could remember the name of it. NSC 51 or 58. I can't remember which one it is. But there's a lot of stuff out there, also that talks about that. And some people who are more conspiratorial minded in what you're talking about when people think about conspiracies, they put it all to that. Whereas I think a broader view is ultimately, if it hadn't have been that directive, it would have been something else that would have created what we exist in today.
Well, do you trust the term like when things get labeled national security? Like, do you trust that word? Or are you more looking into you need to explain what that word is?
Oh, national security is an excuse to hide wrongdoing, usually, Yeah, and it's it's an excuse. I mean, I heard that when I used to work at the University of Vermont, and we were trying to get we were trying to get the university to divest from defense industry, portfolios in their endowment portfolio, and we would start to get too close, and then about investigating what exactly they were doing on campus, what Lockheed Martin was doing on campus, what Boeing or whatever, what General Dynamics. And once we got to a certain point, all of a sudden we were told that's a national security issue. You can't go any further, And basically that meant they were doing something that they probably didn't want anybody to know about, because it was probably, if not illegal, certainly immoral.
What would be a good historical point of reference you would show to people to, I guess, wouldn't say a clear picture of the deep state, but let's call it the establishment. I like that word. But I would just point to people towards like the whole like limiting the counterculture movement is a prime example. The whole 70s and 60s is a prime example, which is government stuff that was going on and trying to censor people's speech. We see it happen today. Censorship is still a relative issue, but it's just easier to point to the past because it's a little bit disconnected. And I feel like people will look at it more openly than they will with any problems that get tossed out today. But we've really never had anybody that's challenged the establishment. At least in my mind, the only person I can think of is Kennedy, maybe Nixon, just with the fact that he thought he was in control of them, and then he start like, no, that's not how it works. But Kennedy actually, Wall Street and all these types of things, he was really pushing at the bill when it came to messing up financial interests. And I think that's another clear sign of it as well, too. But I can't point to a good historical reference for someone to be like, this is what you need to look at for historical purposes when it comes to understanding a deep state.
Yeah, that's a challenging, because I can't think of any particular one. I mean, there's so many different events that happen and trends. And it's interesting, I mean, that you mentioned Kennedy and Nixon, and I would in it, and I would also toss in, even though I'm not really a fan of any of those guys, I would also toss in Trump, only because it's not that they weren't part of the establishment, but they were renegades from the more established establishment, I mean, and so it was new money coming in, a new power elite that was trying to push its way you know into
Call it
the
a
top
frat.
ruling
It's a
elites and
frat.
so on.
It's a frat in the government. You can call it that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and basically that's what it's. I mean, you look at okay, the Bushes, they were Skull and Bones, they were Yale, they were CIA, they were all this kind of stuff, and they came from the old money, as opposed to and um, Nixon, well, Kennedy and Trump came out of the money made from bootlegging and all the illegal activities around prohibition. And Nixon and those guys, they were sponsored by oil money, which was relatively new. I mean, Western oil money, when Texas started being one of the major oil producing in California and so on. So it's hard to explain, because there's so many loose ends and there's so many different directions that it could go. But there was this guy, Carl Oglesby, I think it was him. I think he was the first president of the Students for Democratic Society. He tended towards a left libertarian kind of viewpoint, emphasis on the libertarian. And he wrote a book, I'm pretty sure it was him, about basically the essence of it was, he called them the Cowboys. And I forget the name of the Cowboys was the Nixon element of the
And the
ruling class.
Yankees were the
The Yankees and the Cowboys. That's it. Yeah,
I know
yeah.
what you're talking
And
about.
so you know that book, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so basically that was kind of his theory, and it holds up. I mean, no theory holds up completely, because there's always holes or flaws, or you could say, well, what about this? What about that? But in a general way, it kind of does explain those men that you mentioned and Trump as being outsiders. At the same time, they were insiders. you know.
Well, where did the Students for Democratic Society get their information to develop their perspective? Much like how you mentioned your dad would say, you haven't seen what I've seen. Your dad had more of a patriotism view, which I think a lot of Americans have this like American exceptionalism that's just kind of around us. But then you had a different point of view because you've looked at some obviously other things that show you a different perspective than maybe what your dad had. I'm wondering, where do the Students for Democratic Society get their perspective to the point where they branch off in two different directions? I get the suppression that a lot of people weren't. I mean, Black Panther Party, they were not being heard. They had to do something. But then you get the other side of the Weather Underground, which was not as violent as the extremists that had a different take on things, but it becomes where it separates, divides, and then it gets lost. And that's much like with any group that really tries to challenge an establishment type, it gets lost.
Well, they started out of God, it was one of the left democratic socialist groups that kind of became very anti-Soviet during the 50s. And so they basically stopped calling themselves socialists. They stopped calling, they kicked any communists out of their group. But they did give money to a group of students with Tom Hayden, I believe, at the forefront, and a couple of those, the original members. Um, and the point was to create it was originally called the Student League for Industrial Democracy. Michael Harrington was in the group that the Socialist Party USA is what I actually believe it was. That was a parent organization, and they had made it very clear they were anti-communist, they were anti-Soviet, because they wanted to come off as patriotic Americans and so on. And they also knew that with how deep the repression was against the left back in the 50s and the early 60s, that a lot of them would have ended up in jail if they didn't make it very clear that they were Americans first and then socialists or whatever. But anyhow, the Students for the Democratic Society came out of the Students League for Industrial Democracy, and it was pretty much a social. It was kind of about the same where I would say Bernie Sanders was when he first started running for president. Like in his 2016. Patriotic. They believed that America had the potential. The United States had the potential to be the country that they were told it was. And I think so first they started off doing student work and doing a lot of work with with various groups, civil rights work, freedom riders, that kind of stuff. And then going in around 65, 66, they started focusing more on the war in Vietnam as it became big after Kennedy was killed. And then in the first year of Johnson's presidency, when the war, they started sending more and more troops over there, and it became bigger and bigger, and people were starting to see some of their friends getting drafted and being sent over there as opposed to getting drafted and not having to worry about it, so, and I think when they started focusing on the war, and then they also started focusing on inner city work, doing a lot of work that now is kind of done by community organizations, NGOs, even some government groups, stuff like what Head Start does now, stuff like food banks, trying to get rent control in, all just basic kind of stuff for people living in working class and poor neighborhoods so that they could survive.
Assisted living.
Yeah, kind of like mutual aid kind of stuff, so on. Yeah. But then as the war got bigger and bigger and was taking more and more people and became more and more of an issue, and the images were coming back and the GIs were coming back talking about the stuff that they had done and how murderous and what was really going on over there, and that a lot of the Vietnamese didn't want Americans there. They just wanted to be Vietnamese, and so on, and all that kind of stuff that happened. So by 1968, the war was their main focus, and they were also by then they probably had close to 100,000 members across the United States. Probably about 50,000 of them were dues paying, but a lot of other people identified as SDS, and they were reaching into the high schools and even into junior highs in like big cities like New York and Boston and places that are more liberal in general. Anyhow, so they and so that basically started to create a situation where those people who were not completely against the war drifted away. But by the time that happened, most people were getting in the SDS, and a lot of college students and young people in general were becoming more and more militant, just because they were getting more and more frustrated. So by '69, when they split, and there was communist groups that were, you know, pretty active inside SDS, and they were doing what they operate as a block, so they were able to push through um, elements and proposals through and get the national organization endorsement, primarily because they voted as a block instead of as different individuals. And I mean, that's just kind of how that works. Unions do the same thing. Caucuses and unions do the same thing. They do it in Congress. You have the right-wing guys over there, the Freedom Caucus. They block stuff so that they can get at least some of what they wanted. So it's basically typical politics inside a relatively closed organization. But basically it was just the frustration over the war that drove so many people to the extreme ends.
Just because I'm a generation disconnected from the Vietnam War, I mean, we learn about it, but would you say that was like the first time people ever really came in contact with what the actual communism is and realized it wasn't like the one that was painted over here as like everyone that is a communist? Like, oh, you can get labeled a communist over here back then. And a lot of those people I really debate on if they were actually communists or not, or just what they were trying to label as extremist or something of that sort. But it seems like when people came back from the Vietnam War, there was a lot of dissent amongst going over there. There was a lot of people that either had it before or shared their opinion afterwards. And then you were labeled a communist for having that dissent when really you just came in contact with the actual version of it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it was the first time. I mean, there was maybe another comparable time, but this was before there was actually a Communist Party in the United States. Was during World War One, when the Wobblies, when the Wobblies were big and doing a lot of, and the industrial workers of the world, and they were leading those giant strikes and the free speech things. And then when the Russian Revolution happened, that made a lot of people, a lot of regular working people were attracted to that because because the disparity in power and in money and everything was so great, kind of like what it is today, the inequality, because that was the time of the robber barons. And now today we have a new time of the robber barons, where we have a lot of people who are incredibly poor and relatively few people who are very, 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 very wealthy. But I think what you're saying is actually when communism was a thing. And then, I grew up always hearing about how terrible the communists were. And so people who are just a few years older than me, who were in high school, say when I was in junior high, or who, it was continuous. It was throughout school. It was, it was on the TV. It was in the movies. I mean, everywhere you went, it was communism bad, communism bad, communism bad. And then when people started reading about it and actually kind of realizing and or experiencing it when they went over to Vietnam and started talking to, seeing what was going on, if they didn't think it was okay, they at least wondered, well, why do we care? That's their business, and our business is different. I mean, I don't think the United States would ever become socialist, just because I think it's such a capitalist country that the best that we can hope for is for the country to at least try to, like it did for a little while, beginning with Roosevelt, and all the way up until probably mid '70s, but definitely by the '80s it was over. They at least there was an attempt to bring everybody up, so at least they had a job, had a place to live, could get whatever education they wanted to get at a reasonable cost and all that kind of stuff. So because I think that's as best as we can do. But a lot of the stuff that was, say, once again, I'll bring him up. A lot of the stuff was in the Bernie Sanders campaign. Just kind of like making things a little more fair and making it so that the wealthy people can't continue to completely destroy the rest of the planet in the search of their profits, etc.
I would ask, do you think that communism was a great brush or great point to bring out that really defended or cloaked even more capitalism? It seems like a lot of people, maybe some people are obviously aware of the establishment and things of that sort, but it seems like the word communism really detracted from the overall business ties. I mean, when do you think capitalism really had an excel point? I know in the Great Depression, there was a question if we were going to stick with the capitalist model. just because it seemed like it failed and it didn't work. We might have to try a new method. And then we ended up sticking with capitalism. And now there is no middle class, but it's excelled to a point where it's very clear now. I'm just curious if there was a time period where you can notice that there was just this massive overall infestation of capitalism. And also, do you think communism was a great scapegoat for capitalism to keep growing and spreading? Because obviously we notice it's pretty deeply connected now.
I would, I don't know if I can answer the first part of that question, but the second part,
It's either a good question or a bad question.
yeah, communism certainly was a scapegoat, and I think it continues to be. I mean, you see the right wing, bringing it up all the time, like Trump, saying we're going to chase. If I get elected, I'm going to chase all the leftist vermin out of the country. All blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Capitalism, it's hard to say, but I really think capitalism has been in the driver's seat since the late 1800s in the United States. I really do. When they were able to stifle various labor movements, I mean, rather violently, because there was the strikes were massive back then. I mean, when you think of like the Pullman Railroad strike in 1877, all the different minor strikes, and they just basically, they were very violent. They brought out the Pinkertons, they brought out the military, and the Pinkertons killed, dozens of people in labor camps and stuff. So, and I think after that, a lot of, and then I think maybe another time when a lot of the American population really started to accept it and want it and say, yeah, go capitalism, was in the 60s when a lot of, at least white people, were really, late 50s and through the 60s, when a lot of the white people, which is the majority of the people in the United States, were doing pretty well. They could buy a home, they could raise a family, they could send their kid to college, they could, they could buy a car, they had a decent life, they could take vacations. But a big reason for that, and it is because there's enough workers who are unionized. Like it was around union membership in the United States at the time was probably between 20 and 30%. And now it's like around 10% at the best, And so those people, by the fact that there was that many workers who were unionized, they were able to bring up the wages of everybody else because, employers would do that just to keep the union out of their workplace. And then when the onslaught against the unions began, and it began in earnest under Nixon, but even Nixon was smart enough and shrewd enough to know that he had to work with the unions. I mean, he was buddies with the Teamsters.
I know we got to get into Jimmy Hoffa. I was going to mention it.
He was
like,
buddies.
we got to.
I mean, those guys, and the thing with the unions is like it wasn't all the capitalist fault that unions became less popular. Sure, Ronald Reagan went after him with a vengeance, and he wanted to get rid of the unions more than any president until Trump. But the thing was that the unions they got taken. Some of the unions got taken over by the mob and other criminal enterprises. And what the big thing was, like in the 1940s, 47, 48, whenever they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically limited the right of unions to organize. They reversed a lot of stuff that had been completely liberalized under Roosevelt, only earlier in the decade, actually. And so they basically said anybody who was a communist or socialist, if they wanted to be, the AFL-CIO said, if you want to be a member of the AFL-CIO, you have to kick all your communists and socialists out of the union. And most of the unions did that. The Teamsters didn't, but that's because they were pretty much already under the influence of, they didn't need the AFL-CIO. They were strong enough on their own. The main union, the biggest union that did it, that didn't go along with that and refused to kick out their leftists, was the Union of Electrical and Radio Workers. Now it's called UE. And they still exist, but they probably have a couple 100,000, 300,000 members, but they've always rejected. They've always refused to go along with the AFL-CIO. Basically, when you join an AFL-CIO member union, you have to promise to respect and defend the Constitution, and you also have to say that you will do political work, but it will only be through the mainstream parties. So that they wanted to limit limit anybody on the left. And they lost a lot of good organizers, because leftists tend to be some of the people, the best organizers, because they truly believe in what they're doing, and they're willing to go out there and pass out leaflets and argue with people to convince them to join the union and all that kind of stuff. Whereas most people who are in unions, they like it because it helps them, it gives them job security more or less, and it gives them better benefits, and it gives them a way to redress grievances with their employer. But I mean, I was a local president for the last 3 years of my working, when I was working full time, and that's basically was my experience. There's a few activists who are really strong and wanted to do a lot of stuff with the union, but most people, it was like pulling teeth to even get them to vote in the election for their steward or their officer, because to them it was just like another part of the job. Like when you get a job, you go into HR and you fill out your tax papers and your medical papers and all that kind of stuff. To them, it was just one more thing. It wasn't they didn't feel a big part of it. And I think a lot of that disinterest happened because the unions kind of the union leadership gave the unions a bad name.
Yeah, I'm going to ask about that, the union stigma, I guess, because I've heard it from some people that unions shouldn't be allowed or unions are bad. I was like, well, aren't unions important to putting the power to the worker if they want to demand that they get paid more? I mean, shouldn't they get paid more? But I see companies now not, I guess, putting in their contracts not to have unions, or you can't have a union or start a union. I was like, I thought that's against your fundamental right as a human being to be able to unionize the workers' union, that you're supposed to be able to get benefits for yourself. I mean, look, I have a controversial opinion on Jimmy Hoffa. I know a lot of people don't like him, but he made the Teamsters Union and really helped out a lot of people. So I'm like, I wish it wasn't a crime figure that did it, but for God's sakes, he was fighting for a lot of people and did help out a lot of people. I think the percentage under his reign or something like that went up drastically, as much as Robert Kennedy's towing for the mob went up drastically. But for me, it's like, if we can get past the mob stuff, obviously I'm not defending him as a person, but he did a lot of good things for those truckers. And I was like, to me, that was really, really important, because you got to think about the people that get left to the side, and then capitalism or corporations get all the money and all that. And these people don't get treated properly. Maybe I'm mistaken on the unions then.
No, I think you're right. I mean, unions are like anything else. They're a bundle of contradictions, and you could have a great union leader and great who's really strong and gets stuff for his people, for the people in their union and so on. But that doesn't, they can still be a crook. And that's because there's so much money there. It's kind of,
Human nature.
yeah, and some people just can't help themselves, especially when that's kind of like how people get ahead in this, ultimately that's how people get ahead in this country is, the first year, like let's go back to the Kennedys. All that Kennedy money was made from illegal activities.
Let's do it, because the 60th is coming up. I'll post this at the 60th.
Yeah. And the next generation, they were all just great. They're the Kennedys. They're Catholics. They proved that Catholics can make it in the WASP, the WASP society, and and they're wealthy, and they're just rich people, and they made it and so on. But nobody talks about, oh yeah, they made it because they were bootleggers and gunslingers and whatever. Just like Trump's money came from his father being a crook, basically, pimping and running dope or whatever, And so it's all like, the Rockefellers' money came from like stealing
gold mines in Indonesia and all that.
Yeah. So it's all funny because, capitalism is just better organized crime than what we consider crime. It's organized crime that becomes legal. Regarding the union, I think it should be easier for people to join unions. And those contracts that you're talking about, I don't know. They used to be illegal. They're called yellow dog contracts. And they used to, I don't know I forget where the terminology, the phrase comes from, but they used to be illegal in a lot of states because it basically went against the First Amendment, the right to peacefully assembly to address your grievances, right? But it's a good possibility, I'm sure. And my brother told me in the tech stuff. I have a brother who owns a small tech company out in California, along with a couple of his friends, and he said it's almost a standard clause in their contracts that you won't that you won't unionize. And he said the thing is, most of the people that he's hired, he said they don't believe in unions anyhow because they're a bunch of, they're almost all libertarians. He says they don't. He says a lot of his people, they don't even like people, so why would what they want to have to work to, you know what I mean, like join a union and then actually have to communicate with other people except through their computer and so on. He says they're great coders, but he says they need a little work on socialization and stuff. So if those contracts are out there, I wouldn't be surprised at all, because I know they've always been there, even in the States when they were illegal and so on.
I want to ask about organized crime. Obviously, I'm disconnected from that as much as I am disconnected from the Vietnam War. I've been learning a lot about it because I have a large interest in it. To me, it's just fascinating. I don't think they killed Kennedy or anything. I'm just interested in learning about their presence. I mean, you had real gangsters walking around the streets and being political. There's a famous photo I want to get on my wall of Jimmy Hoffa going like this with his middle finger itching his eye when he's in the middle of a hearing. I mean, as much as they joked and they made fun of these politics and these inner shenanigans, at one point they worked with our government to try and assassinate Castro, and probably in other various things as well too. But I mean, what was it like? I mean, from a historical perspective, I mean, what would you, in your mind, what is the impact of that on just the American people? I mean, my generation's disconnected, but I don't know if you could explain a little bit more about the times on that one.
There's this guy. His name is Doug Valentine, and
Yeah.
he's written some really good books on that. Probably his most famous book is on the Phoenix program over
The Vietnam War, yeah.
in Vietnam. Yeah. But he wrote 2 books about the drug war in the United States back when it was like all Harry Anslinger. So basically, the reason I bring it up is because he talks a lot about how the United States, first the OSS and then what ultimately became the CIA, how they made deals with different gangsters, allowing them to bring in, when they had the French connection through Marseille, and that's when the heroin used to come through Turkey, opium, then get processed in Marseille, and then get shipped over to the United States and up into other parts of Europe. And so basically, the United States basically let them smuggle this in because they were doing work not just against Castro, over in Italy right after World War II. And when they were after they had, gotten, locked up the remaining fascists and so on that they wanted to lock up. Italy was getting ready to have its first elections since probably before the war. And the communists were probably going to win. It was the communists, the Christian Democrats, and one other party. But it was basically the one other party was kind of going to be like a spoiler. They're going to and so ultimately if one of the other parties, if the communists or the Christian Democrats had won and they didn't get a majority, they would have to make a deal with one of the other parties to get the parliamentary majority, because that's how it works in
Politics
countries that have parliaments as opposed to what we have. So they the United States, the CIA organized. They worked together with different members of the Cosa Nostra in Italy and in the United States to subvert the election, beat the hell out of communists, get communist organizers, communist people trying to get people to the polls. They stuffed ballot boxes, they stole ballot boxes, and ultimately they helped turn the election in favor of the party that the United States was sponsoring, which was the Christian Democrats. And the United States dumped tons of money into the Christian Democrats campaign because they did not want the communists to win anything beyond what they used to call the Iron Curtain. France had a similar situation, but the CIA wasn't as involved in that, mostly because France really didn't like the United States in its country that much. That was de Gaulle, and de Gaulle ultimately won, and was the president, the premier president, whatever they call it, for a while. So it's hard to say how much influence they had through the manipulations that they were allowed to do.
He did. Jimmy Hoffa did like $400,000 to Nixon's campaign or something. Like, no. Howard Hughes. He's not even a gangster. He's just a a business movie pilot inventor guy, but there's Nixon Burger. His brother's Nixon's brother had a burger chain restaurant.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah,
Yeah,
Donald.
and when
Yeah,
he took a photo in front of
I
that
forgot about
banner,
that.
and it's
Yeah,
all in
yeah,
like Vietnamese or something like that, and they had a good laugh about it, but it said ask about the loan, and then they get fortune cookies and they're all laughing, like making fun of communism, and then they crack open and the thing in the fortune read ask him about the loan because Howard Hughes had loaned his brother all this money, and also Jimmy Hoffa did it too with his Teamsters Union. But that's crazy. I get goosebumps talking about it. To me, that's just I don't know. It's just the craziest kind of like side jab into someone to be like, hey, ask him about the loan. Like,
yeah,
oh
yeah,
God, he
right.
took money.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's kind of like any of those gangster movies, they are kind of true, especially the ones that talk about the mob, like Godfather and some of those other ones that came out after that, you know, and it goes back to I believe it was Coppola, maybe, or maybe one of the people who worked on the screenplay for the Godfather movies said that basically this is just a story of American capitalism. Yeah, and it's true. I mean, it's just how it operates. And they put their money into legal businesses, but at the same time they had their hands in all the illegal stuff that was going on. So
Do you think the government used the mob only because it gave them plausible deniability of some of the actions that were going on?
I'm sure that was a big part of it. I think another part of it too was because they also knew that they had the yeah, it was definitely a lot of the plausible deniability, but they also knew that they had the skill to plan those operations and carry them out. And people might not even find out about them, if ever, at least for several years, which is what happened. Nobody found out about those for years, and there's still stuff that occasionally gets uncovered if you want to start looking for it.
I mean, what would you say would be things like how the mob was just these active crime figures were just walking around the streets basically and everyone knew who they were? But was there another period where there was like this kind of, we think back on it now where it's kind of shocking to see? I mean, obviously government operations get exposed, but we don't, I mean, was there anything later in the 70s or anything like that? Even the 80s? I don't even hear much about the 80s. I guess it just must have been a disco rave or something like that. But
That's a good question. I mean, like as a lot of the originally Italian crime figures got taken down or retired or whatever. And if you think about how, since the main thing any organized crime has been involved in, it seems, since the late '60s has involved drugs, illegal drugs. And you think about how what happened, as it went from being a European connection to being more of a South American connection and an Asian connection, that kind of changed who was in control, who were the organized crime. But I can't think of any time since then that it was so obvious, not in the United States. I mean, I guess friends of mine who live in Mexico and people I know who lived in Colombia and stuff, they said down there that was comparable, especially during the cocaine heyday, and now the cartels, they basically run different parts of Mexico and everybody knows who they are, but they have enough of the cops in their employ and the federales and so on that they can kind of just operate freely, and just the main thing they have to worry about is their enemies, because like they were in the days that the movies were made, where a lot of people got gunned down in the various family wars, in the the Italian based mafia. That still goes on in organized crime in South America and Mexico and stuff.
when did people become aware of the government's involved? I mean, they're not really necessarily all aware today, but the government working with organized crime. I mean, did they know it after the church committee? Did people talk about it? Because like that's a serious, I mean, not ethical concern, but that would make me question everything. When I started asking questions about what our government's up to.
Yeah, when I first remember hearing about it in the mainstream media was the church hearings. Yeah, because that the whole what he did, he uncovered so much stuff until they basically made it harder for him to get to certain things. And I think he decided, okay, how far can I go without either risking his life or breaking into secrets that might take down the whole government, which he didn't want to do that because he believed in the United States and stuff. But I really remember reading a lot about it in the mainstream media, like and seen it on the TV. 74, 75, 76. The Washington Post had a bunch of stories on it. And I was living in the DC area then. So I read, that's what was my mainstream news source. It had been in different underground papers, and alternative papers like IF Stone Weekly and stuff, investigative reporters who were coming at it from the left. And a lot of the underground newspapers had some access to some of that material. It was being leaked to them. And my guess is that it was kind of like the Pentagon Papers, is that government workers who had run across this information data, at first they tried to give it to Congress people or to mainstream media, but it was probably too hot for them to deal with, or there wasn't enough verification. Because if you think about it, if you're working for a mainstream media outlet and you're kind of like, you want to keep your job and you want to go up in the world, you got a career path, etc., that involves it involves being careful, let's say, about what you put out there about the government and about people in power and so on. So obviously, so the only way a mainstream media thing is going to publish that is if they can have verification from so many different sources that they can go ahead and go forward with it. I don't know. I think we talked a little bit or mentioned, all the president's men, and basically the main source for that was a disgruntled FBI agent. And Deep Throat, that's who he turned out to be.
Allegedly Mark Felt, but I think that was the only time anything was ever confirmed from one source and not have a backed up source to prove
and
it.
They didn't have a backup, but I think it's because the nature of who the source was that Benjamin Bradley went ahead and said, okay, we can do this. And even what's her name, Catherine Graham, I think, was in on the, and who knows, maybe they knew him socially.
I think Deep Throat was multiple people.
Yeah, I do too. I think he was the person they met with. And maybe, I think of like when I wrote my Weather Underground book, I think of it was very difficult to get any information out of any Weather Underground member because they still didn't know if they had warrants out on them, because that was in the 90s, early 90s was when I started actually thinking about, okay, I'm going to do this, and asking them, so what I would have to do is I would find stuff like, say, in underground newspapers or in what little FBI stuff had been released at the time on them, and also in mainstream papers. And then I would kind of have to like go backwards from there. And then I could talk to people I knew who had sold drugs to the different Weather Underground members and stuff like that for their acid sessions or whatever. And they could say, oh yeah, I can hook you up with this guy, or you should talk to this person. And I wanted to have at least 3 just unconnected sources before I would put it in my book, because I figured that was pretty good, And they say usually you want to have at least 2. In journalism school, that's kind of what you want to have at least 2 besides your original source. And so I wanted to have at least 3 besides my original source. So there was stuff that later came out in books that were written later, like Dan Berger's book and a couple other ones, and that were written by actual Weather Underground members, where they put out more information that I had in my notes, but I couldn't find verification from it from other sources, so I didn't print it in. So I think what you're saying about Mark Felt, I'm thinking that a lot of times they had like Woodward, Bernstein, and whoever their staff or the people working with them, the stringers and the freelancers and stuff who were working with them. I think they had this information, and then they would bring it to Felt and if he said, yeah, this is how it happened, or no, that's not how it happened at all, that would help them make the final decision. Do we run with this, or do we set it aside till we have more data, or we just say, forget it, we're not going to include this in our story at all?
There's just questions about, because there's some of the meetings that Bernstein and all them talked about where he'd move a potted plant or something like that to be able to see me. Well, some of their timing is off because Mark Felt was in another area. Unless he can time travel, or Deep Throat was 2 people, or they just fabricated a bit of that story or fudged it a little bit. I mean, it could be multifactorial there, but there's just, for me, I just don't think Mark Felt's the only one. I think it's multiple people that had information that were maybe coming out later because Mark Felt would get information from somebody else or something of that sort. But I mean, how much do you think the impact of Daniel Ellsberg had, not only on the, I guess, the institution, but also the Nixon and Watergate? I mean, that breaking into students for Democratic, was it? I forgot the name of Democratic offices. Something.
Yeah, the Democratic Central Committee offices in Watergate. Yeah, yeah. I think when immediately Daniel Ellsberg freaked out a lot of people when he released when the Pentagon Papers began to be published, and I mean, I remember my father being like, I remember him like telling me because he asked me what I thought. I said, I'm glad that information's out there, and he said, well, he said, there's a reason we have secrets. And I said, well, it seems to me the reason there's secrets is because you want to hide the facts from the American people, and they're the ones who should know. And so we had our little ongoing conversation. It was comparable to the one we had when Chelsea Manning, when they were still Bradley, and they released that wiki
WikiLeaks.
The WikiLeaks with the helicopter gunman shooting down the journalists in the main one of the main squares in Baghdad. But anyhow, the government was freaking out. My father told me like later. He said, "Yeah," he said, "in our office, he said we got directives from the main office in NSA, which were handed down from the White House that we needed to. They had to go through a brand new protocol. They added, he said, we added at least 2 more levels of security to every single document that we had, whether they were classified top secret or not classified at all. So he said gave us more work, but it was all about enhancing the security. And he said we had to go through more. There was more vetting of civilians, especially that they worked with. But he said also with GIs and people who weren't career officers, people who were in there, who had joined the Air Force because they didn't want to get drafted to go to Vietnam. So they signed up for 4 years in the Air Force, and they had certain skills like, they could write, they could type or whatever, because they were college graduates or whatever. And so they would end up working, they would send them to Germany or to Italy, wherever they were sent for one of their stations. And they would work with them. And he said, but we had to vet them even more. And so I asked him what that meant. And he just said, well, someone like you, for example, we would not have been able to hire because he said because of your work against the war, just because I had joined different protests and stuff.
Which is so weird because you would think that anybody that would have criticism or things that you can do that are obviously checking unchecked powers, you'd want them involved. But I guess they're not thinking about correcting themselves. They just want to make sure they can do whatever they want.
Yeah, they want to remain an unchecked power. Yeah, I mean that's why supposedly, if you believe in, the stuff we got taught in civics class or whatever they call it, social studies, that's why you have the checks and balances. But when the checks aren't checking the balances and the balances aren't checking the checks, that's what we have is a system of unchecked power. And that's where we're at now. That's where we're at then. And like you said, the Church Committee and Watergate shook it up a little bit. But then basically a lot of the stuff that Nixon did that was illegal, a lot of that's no longer illegal. I think that's part of the reason why they had such a hard time. And then the other part is a lot of people don't care. That's why they had such a hard time going after Trump, even though, he was brazen compared to Nixon. A lot of his crookedness was like pretty brazen, and he's still getting away with it because people don't want to go after him, or because a lot of his campaign stuff that was illegal under Nixon, when Nixon did it, is not as illegal. Plus, any good campaign organization found the loopholes in the law, so they can continue to get their $400,000 in cash from the Teamsters or whatever, and figure out a way to process it. You have to be pretty stupid to get caught for campaign stuff, kind of like that Santos guy. He was just like too obvious, kind of like it looks like Eric Adams in New York City might get caught just because he was too obvious about what he was spending his money, the campaign money on.
I get,
Because
yeah,
there's obviously ways you can set it up where you can spend the money however you want, but you have to you have to make sure it can't be traced back to the source or whatever.
even with Nixon, the amount that you had to look at like all these different things he was funneling money into, and like you had to when you're tracing it, it's not like simple stuff. It's not like he was like, hey, here's $400,000 in cash right up front to in broad daylight. They were done through like offshore and like all like weird meetings and from other people as advisors, specific advisor that had to be in the room that everyone knew that was Nixon's guy. So that means you technically have Nixon at your table. Like there's stuff like that where I go, that means that somebody all out exposed your garbage. And that means you were attacked. I mean, I'm not saying, like I said, not Nixon's not defending him at all, but
Right.
I
Oh
really,
yeah, sure.
I just go
Sure.
question when like they're like, oh, this scandal just broke. I was like, whenever it's someone that you guys support, your scandal never breaks. There's never a scandal on the guy that toes the company line, but there's always someone that shakes up the system. My issue is that I don't want it to be something where we forget around us the events that are so significant. If you look at that whole 70s era, it's Watergate, but it's Nixon. I'm like, guys, he's not the only one doing bad. I hope we don't look back and go, Trump was 2020. I hope we don't look back at that. I go, well, there were some serious concerns, like when it came to either documentation that was released or other things that we're doing in other countries, getting out of Afghanistan. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I do not want to be meshed into where that's the only thing that we're teaching culturally, because that doesn't look good on us as humans when it just comes to we got to move forward and check some of these things that have not been checked.
Yeah, you hit a good point there. How we tend to how American politics, whether it's intentional or whether it's just the way we are because of our individualist culture or whatever, but and our focus on personalities, we tend to personalize politics. So, like you said, yeah, it was Nixon, 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 and I already think it's Trump, Trump, Trump. I mean, if you look at the stuff coming out now for the upcoming presidential campaign, they keep on talking about Trump, 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 and it's kind of like, well, yeah, Trump did some bad things, but the only reason Trump is a likely candidate, um, a likely opponent in 2024 is because you didn't take care of business and convict him of something. Because obviously there's plenty of stuff to be convicted of out there, but they're just like not wanting to do that because it makes it easier for them to campaign against Trump. At the same time, like you said, there's this other stuff. I mean, there's this other stuff that's going on and is greater than any individual president, any individual group of Congress people or whatever that, and that just goes
Money
on.
funneled into Ukraine when $700 was only donated once to the people of Maui when their fires happened. We don't even talk about Maui anymore. It's all gone. I'm like, where's those people? Our lives are destroyed still. It didn't just go away.
Yeah. 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 It's and that's the thing is like, we think politics operates in 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 4 year cycles because that's how we're trained to think. And that's what the media, it makes it so that the media has something to talk about and can whip everybody up every 4 years or whatever. But yeah, the greater issues are the things that we don't talk about, if ever. Definitely once they're gone for a little while, we don't even think about them anymore until somebody brings them up 10 years down the road and says, what the hell did we do here? Like, Afghanistan dragged on for 20 years. And, every once in a while, someone would bring something up. But for the most part, it was kind of like in 1984, where there's always the war going on, in the novel 1984. There's always a war going on, but nobody thinks about it except when the government decides they need to detract people from something more local. So it's frustrating because it's been going on and it exists, and also you kind of have this feeling like 20 years from now you'll be like, yeah, this is what I was saying 20 years ago, but nobody wanted to hear about it then. So
what are your thoughts on the two-party system? I tend to have disbelief in it just because of the fact I just believe too much in a deep state or establishment to even think that I'm not saying every election is rigged at all. I'm sure there's election fraud or all that type of stuff. I'm sure that happens in every election. I'm sure it's a small percentage though. I just don't vote. I don't have a candidate. I don't have a dog in the battle because I just don't think, I think not the outcomes already picked, But I just think that there's a lot of things that start happening during elections that will rig it in their favor, someone who best fits their interest. My only basis for that is regime change in other countries trying to put someone that they approve as being in charge of that country. That we know we've done that with foreign powers, where I start going, I mean, if you can spark up or get the press to start labeling somebody or doing something. They labeled Robert Kennedy Jr. an anti-vaxxer as soon as he announced his presidential campaign. I was like, come on, like all of media was doing that. And it was like, whether you want to say it's true or not, I'm just saying that's not who the man is. He's a good guy. Listen to some of his policies, but you just see kind of targeting start to happen. And that's why I've never voted. It's not that I don't think I have a duty or anything to do so. It's hard for me to understand or believe it when I can look in the past and show you how many times it's failed.
I think the two-party system is really just a one party. I think it's two sides of the same coin, and they represent the same people. They represent different groups of powerful people and powerful entities in the upper classes of the United States. And I think on certain things, it doesn't matter who you have in. I mean, certain things like is the defense industry going to get a lot of money? Yeah, it doesn't matter who's in. It doesn't matter if it's the Democrats or the Republicans. No matter what, the defense budget will always go up. It always has, and it always will because of the power that they have and whatever else. I mean, I vote. I don't always vote for president because, like you, I don't really feel anybody represents me. And then I vote more. I do vote on local elections, all the way up to the state level, usually, unless there's really nobody who serves who represents any of my interests. I agree with you about how they totally go after third party candidates, and even I mean RFK Jr. He tried to run as a Democrat, and basically the Democrats said it ain't going to happen. The Democratic leadership said that's not going to happen.
They did the same thing with Bernie Sanders.
Yes, yeah, and Bernie made the same mistake. But the other side of it is third party candidates. They're the two party system is set up to keep everybody else out of the race. The most they can do is like say someone like Ross Perot back in 1980. He was it 1980 or was it 19? Whenever he ran, I can't remember. He took away enough of the. It must have been 1992 or 88. He took away enough of the votes so that I wish I could remember so that the Republican was able to. Was it the Republican was able to win or the Democrat? I can't remember. My history's going wrong, but basically that's all they can ever do is be a spoiler. For example, one I know for sure, 1968, George Wallace ran as an American Independent Party, and he was very far right. He was kind of like what Donald Trump is now. And it was ultimately it was Nixon for the Republicans and Humphrey for the Democrats, and he took away. George Wallace took away enough votes, I believe, from the Democrats. He took away like the Dixiecrat vote from the Democrats, because he was racist, and Hubert Humphrey was not racist. Hubert Humphrey was a civil rights guy, and so they took away enough. But they took away more votes from the Democrats, which allowed Nixon to squeeze by and win. And that's all a third party candidate has ever done in the 20th century or in the 21st century. Some people still blame Ralph Nader for W winning back, what was it, 2000? But that's kind of a silly argument when you think about how many votes were actually out there. So, and I think it goes back to what I kind of touched on earlier when I mentioned parliamentary systems, where, under parliamentary systems, if a party or a candidate gets meets a certain threshold of votes in the general election, they get representation in the legislature. Whereas here it's winner take all. So it's always going to be between. I mean, you have a couple independents in the like Bernie Sanders is an independent in the Senate, and there's a couple. I think there's one or two independents in the House, and the independents in the House lean more towards the Republicans, and Bernie Sanders is basically a Democrat. So if if we had proportional representation like they do in most European and a lot of Asian parliaments, I think it would completely change the way power is distributed. but I believe also that when they created the Constitution, that was the compromise that the radicals, however many there were actually in the Constitutional Convention, that was the compromise they made with the plantation owners and the Southerners to keep them in the Union, because the Southerners wanted to make sure that they were going to be able to basically have minority power, the plantation owners, and they did until the Civil War, through the various, like giving slaves 3/5 of a vote and all that kind of stuff, and then creating the Senate, two senators, no matter how big, how populated the state was, and so on. I always think it's interesting. Vermont has 2 senators. There's not even 1 million people here, and California, there's like how many millions of
20
people,
million.
and they have
Like 20 million.
Yeah, and they have 2 senators. So that's not exactly. That's kind of basically representation with unequal representation completely. But that's how, and then the Electoral College is set up essentially the same way, which is why it makes sure that those in power, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, that group stays at the top. That's why I say I really just see it as a one party.
I agree with you. Really I agree with you. I think we're in the same boat on that one. I know we didn't have a structure to this conversation, but I do appreciate it anyway, because I think we covered a lot of good topics.
We're kind of rambling all over here.
I love it, dude. So what my show is about, conversation. But no, I wanted to ask you one last question, which is, I mean, from your perspective, in your opinion, do you think things obviously will change when it comes to looking at capitalism a little bit deeper? I mean, what would you recommend the best thing for people my generation and others to do? Dive into history or try and sort out reality for themselves?
Well, everybody has their own approach. For me, history helps a lot. And reading history from from a kind of like an anti-capitalist, or at least objective, not pro-capitalist viewpoint. And those books are out there. I mean, I don't know, I'm not exactly, I could come up with some titles if I thought about it, but if that kind of helps. And then the other part is just kind of, if people can kind of understand that the driving force behind pretty much everything done in the United States, and I would say nowadays in the world, but especially in the United States, because the United States is still the most dominant country, politically, militarily, and I think it's still economically the most dominant country. But China is pretty close, and basically they're all capitalist. There are no non-capitalist countries in the world anymore. There's some that are less capitalist or have a different version of capitalism than what the United States has, because basically they have more brakes on what the billionaires can do. I mean, like China has a lot of controls, and the United States used to have those back, like from Roosevelt up until the 80s, because they understood that if you let capitalism just do its thing, that it's going to make such vast inequality that you're going to have a lot of people living on the streets. You're going to have a lot of people not being able to take care of their children properly, and so on. And they know, and also bottom line is, you're not going to have enough people who can buy the stuff you're trying to sell, which is what keeps capitalism going. And that's one thing, like, if you look at the difference between in the 20th century and the 21st century, you look at what the Democratic Party does when they're in power and what the Republican Party does when they're in power. And I'm actually, it's even, the Democrats are much more interested in redistributing enough of the wealth to the working people and to the poor people, whether they're working or not, so that they can at least buy some of the goods that capitalism produces. Because if you don't have people buying your goods, you get this what's called overproduction, which creates a depression. And when Reagan came in, they started started selling things overseas and everything. And so that's what they did with their overproduction. But now, like, countries like China and stuff, most of what they produce, they sell to their own people. But eventually they'll run into, if they can continue to let capitalism lead the way, without any brakes on it and redistribution of the wealth, on some level, then they're going to run into the same situation that any capitalist country runs into, which you can look at Britain, you can look at the United States, you can even look at Germany, and because Germany's starting to see some of this too, as they relax the social welfare aspect of their governments. More money has gone to the top, and more people are. The economic stress has increased for more and more people even those people who are working one or two jobs and stuff. So I think if people look at it that way, and if they're in a place that has a union or is interested in organizing the union, they should jump in, because that's a good way to really, I think it's a really hands-on, direct way, personal way where one can learn the power that they have as when they get together and create organizations to kind of, if not overthrow capitalism, at least try to like make capitalism a little fairer than its tendency is. I mean, capitalism is like a cancer. Unless you keep it at bay, it just consumes, because that's its natural. That's what it does. That's how it survives. And it's not a moral thing. It's just the fact. It's how money works under that system. So.
Ron, I appreciate the time. I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.